Imagine waking up in the morning. Your eyes open, but before your feet even touch the ground, your mind is already racing. Emails, deadlines, unpaid bills, the conversations you replay in your head that you wish had gone differently. 100 tiny storms start swirling before the day has even begun. We live in an age of comfort. Machines wash our clothes, cars carry us, phones connect us instantly across oceans. Yet somehow our hearts are more restless than ever. Anxiety has become the silent background noise of modern existence. It's not just the sudden panic attack in a crowded room. It's the low hum of unease that follows you everywhere, whispering that something is missing, something might go wrong, something is never enough. Why is this happening? Why, with so many conveniences, do we still feel like we're drowning? Think about the constant flood of notifications, each vibration, each ping, pulling at your nerves. Think about the way we scroll endlessly, comparing our lives to the highlight reels of strangers. Think about how every choice we make feels like it carries the weight of failure. The wrong career, the wrong partner, the wrong investment. It's as if life has turned into a never-ending test and we're terrified of failing. But the truth is, it isn't the world that's making us restless. It's our minds. The mind that cannot sit still. The mind that runs like a wild horse into the future, then digs itself into the past but almost never rests in the present. The Buddha once described this perfectly. The mind is like a monkey, leaping from branch to branch, never still for even a moment. And when the mind is restless, anxiety becomes its natural companion. Maybe you felt it, lying in bed at night, your body completely safe, but your heart pounding as if danger is lurking just outside the door. That's anxiety. Not danger itself, but the mind's endless rehearsal for a future it can't control. It's not life attacking us, it's our thoughts. And so we live in this restless storm, a storm we can't seem to escape because we carry it inside us. We try to quiet it with distractions, another scroll, another drink, another purchase. For a moment the storm fades, but only for a moment. Then the winds return, louder than before. This is why so many of us feel exhausted without knowing why. We are not tired because of the miles we've walked, but because of the thoughts we've carried. But here's the secret most people never discover. The storm is not permanent. Beneath the winds, beneath the chaos, there is a place within you that has never been touched by anxiety. A still point, a quiet ground. We have forgotten it, but it has never forgotten us. The real question is not, how do I fight anxiety? The question is, how do I return to the stillness that anxiety can never reach? And perhaps, just perhaps, that is where freedom lies. Because if the storm of anxiety is the symptom, then the medicine is hidden in silence, in stillness, in learning to be at home with ourselves again. And that is the journey we are about to take. Anxiety, it feels like an enemy pressing against us from the outside. But the truth is, it doesn't live out there. It lives here inside the mind. And when you look closely, you see something startling. Anxiety is not life threatening us. It is the mind fighting itself. Think about the moments when worry grabs hold. Your body is safe. You're sitting in a room, perhaps sipping coffee. But suddenly your heart beats faster, your palms sweat, your thoughts spiral into what if, as if invisible hands are tightening around your chest. Why does this happen? Because the mind cannot tell the difference between what is real and what it imagines. When you picture losing your job or failing a test or being rejected by someone you love, the body reacts as though it's happening right now. Anxiety is the echo of imagined futures crashing into the present. Buddhism has a word for this, dukkha, the unsatisfactory, restless quality of existence. It isn't just pain. It's that subtle unease, that itch of the mind that says, things aren't safe, things aren't right, something is missing. Even when nothing is wrong, modern psychology calls it the fight or flight response. Thousands of years ago, this reaction kept us alive when predators lurked in the dark. But today, instead of lions and tigers, our predators are deadlines, emails, social pressure, and fears of failure. The body reacts the same way, but the threats are endless and invisible. So we live with a nervous system always on edge. It's like having a smoke alarm that never stops ringing. At first, it protects you. But when it screams day and night, even when there is no fire, it becomes torture. Anxiety is the mind's alarm gone haywire. The Buddha described the restless mind as a house on fire. Flames of desire, flames of fear, flames of ignorance, burning constantly. And anxiety, it is the smoke that fills the lungs, making it hard to breathe. Have you noticed how the anxious mind never stays in one place? It leaps forward into the future. What if I fail? What if I'm not good enough? What if tomorrow everything falls apart? Then it pulls you back into the past. Why did I say that? What if they hate me? I should have done better. It's a tug-of-war that never ends. No matter how hard you pull, you cannot win because the opponent is you. And here's the tragedy. Anxiety is not trying to harm us. At its root, it is the mind's desperate attempt to protect us. Worry is the mind saying, "Let me prepare you for every possible danger, let me keep you safe." But in trying to shield us, it locks us inside a prison of constant fear. This is why you can't simply shout at yourself to stop worrying. That's like shouting at a frightened child. The more you yell, the more afraid the child becomes. Anxiety cannot be crushed with force. It must be understood. Buddhism teaches, to understand suffering is the first step to freedom. When we look directly into the nature of anxiety, we see it for what it truly is. Not a monster, but a misunderstanding. Not an external curse, but an internal confusion. The mind, in its restlessness, has become like a warrior who never lays down his sword, fighting shadows, preparing for battles that never arrive. And the more it fights, the more exhausted it becomes. This is why anxiety leaves us drained even when nothing has happened. We are at war, but the battlefield is inside our own skull. So the question becomes, how do we end this war? How do we calm a mind that has forgotten how to rest? The answer, as strange as it sounds, is not to fight harder. It is to remember something we've lost, a truth that lies beneath the noise, the truth of stillness. Because once you see anxiety for what it really is, a mind battling its own shadows, you begin to wonder, what happens when the fighting stops? What happens when we let go of the illusion of control that keeps the war alive? That is where the path begins to shift. If anxiety is the mind at war with itself, then one of its sharpest weapons is the craving for control. Deep down, almost every worry you carry is rooted in this. The belief that if you can just manage everything perfectly, if you can anticipate every danger, if you can plan enough, then maybe, just maybe, you will finally feel safe. But the truth is, control is a beautiful illusion. And like all illusions, it dissolves the moment you reach for it. Imagine standing on the shore watching the ocean. The waves rise and fall endlessly. You can dig your hands into the water, you can try to push the waves back, but no matter how hard you struggle, the tide will still come in, the tide will still go out. Life is the same. It flows on its own rhythm beyond our command. And yet, how much of our suffering comes from trying to control the tide? We map out our future in spreadsheets. We replay conversations in our minds until they are flawless. We try to shape how others see us, how they love us, how they leave us. But the harder we grip, the more things slip through our fingers. Buddhism has a name for this grasping, tanha, craving, the endless thirst to hold onto what cannot be held. We crave certainty, permanence, guarantees, but reality offers none. Everything shifts, everything changes. And when our craving collides with impermanence, the result is anxiety. Think about the thoughts that keep you awake at night. What if I lose my job? What if my health fails? What if I'm not enough? Each of these questions is a plea for control, a desperate attempt to wrestle with the unknown. But the unknown has always been there, waiting, unshaken by our fears. Here's the irony. The more we try to control life, the less control we actually feel. Because life doesn't bend to our demands, it dances to its own song. And so we live caught in a loop, craving control, failing to find it, feeling anxious, then craving it even more. A cycle without end. There's a story told in Zen Buddhism about a man hanging from a cliff. He clings desperately to a vine, terrified of falling. Above him, a tiger growls. Below him, sharp rocks wait. In his panic, he sees a small strawberry growing nearby. And in that moment, Instead of obsessing about escape, he simply reaches out and tastes the strawberry. For the first time, he is free, not because the danger disappeared, but because he stopped clinging to the illusion of control and embraced the moment before him. Isn't that what anxiety really is? The mind dangling from its own vine, obsessed with the tiger above and the rocks below, unable to see the sweetness of the present moment right in front of it. When you understand this, something shifts. You realize that control has never been the cure for anxiety. In fact, the obsession with control is the very fuel that feeds it. Freedom doesn't come from tightening your grip. It comes from loosening it, from trusting that life can unfold without your constant interference, from allowing uncertainty to exist without turning it into an enemy. The Buddha called this upekkha, equanimity, a balanced mind that does not cling, does not resist, but rests in the flow of things as they are. It doesn't mean you give up. It doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you act wisely, but without the desperate need to control outcomes that were never yours to command. And here's the beauty. When you stop clinging, you don't fall. You finally learn that the ground has been beneath you all along. So if anxiety is born from this restless need to control, then what is its antidote? Where do we turn when the storm is raging and our hands are tired from holding on? The answer lies in something far simpler, far quieter than most people expect. A medicine older than history itself. A power that doesn't come from force, but from stillness. When the storm of anxiety rages inside, most of us reach for more noise. More distractions, more activity, more attempts to drown out the fear. But the truth is, what the anxious mind needs is not more movement, it needs stillness. Stillness is not weakness. It is not laziness. It is not escape. Stillness is the medicine we have forgotten, a medicine older than words, older than civilization. Think of a pond. When the surface is disturbed by wind, the water becomes cloudy, restless, chaotic. But when the wind dies down, the ripples soften and slowly the water clears. Beneath the still surface, the reflection of the sky appears. The pond has not changed, it has only remembered its own nature. Your mind is the same. Beneath the ripples of fear and worry, there is always a deeper clarity. Anxiety is only the wind. Stillness is the calm water waiting underneath. The Buddha discovered this truth under the Bodhi tree. As Mara, the demon of fear and desire, threw every distraction at him, storms, temptations, armies of doubt, he did not fight. He did not run. He simply sat. He touched the earth and remained still. And in that stillness, the storm lost its power. The demons disappeared not because they were destroyed, but because they were no longer fed. This is the secret. Anxiety cannot survive in silence. It feeds on movement, on endless thinking, on resistance. But when you become still, when you stop fueling the fire, anxiety begins to fade on its own. Science now agrees. Researchers have found that practices like meditation and mindful breathing lower cortisol, slow the heart rate, calm the nervous system. Stillness literally rewires the brain, teaching it to relax where it once panicked. But beyond science, stillness carries something even greater. It reconnects you with yourself. It strips away the noise until you begin to remember who you are beneath the worry. There is an old Zen saying, "Sitting quietly doing nothing, spring comes and the grass grows by itself." Imagine that for a moment. No rushing, no controlling, no forcing. Life unfolds. Peace unfolds. Growth happens naturally when we stop interfering. And yet, stillness doesn't mean you have to retreat to a monastery or sit on a mountain peak. True stillness is not about the absence of sound, but the presence of silence within you, even in the middle of the city, even in the middle of chaos. Picture a busy street, horns blaring, people rushing. Now picture yourself walking slowly, breathing deeply, your mind calm, untouched by the noise. That is the power of stillness, to carry silence inside no matter what surrounds you. Have you ever noticed how the most powerful people in a room are often the quietest? They don't need to shout. They don't need to hurry. Their stillness radiates confidence, presence, calm. True strength is silent, not loud. And true healing is quiet, not frantic. So the question becomes, How do we touch this silence in our own lives? How do we begin to practice stillness when anxiety feels overwhelming? The path is simpler than you might expect. It begins with a single breath, a single pause, a single step into awareness. From there, stillness starts to weave itself into the fabric of your daily life, not as something foreign, but as something deeply natural as breathing itself. And this is where our journey turns practical, where stillness moves from being a beautiful idea into something you can live, moment by moment, breath by breath. Wisdom often comes to us not as theory, but as story. Stories have a way of slipping past the busy mind, entering straight into the heart. And when it comes to stillness, some of the greatest teachers in history have spoken, not through lectures, but through their quiet presence. Let's begin where it all began, beneath the Bodhi tree. The Buddha sat unmoving as Mara unleashed his full arsenal: temptation, fear, doubt, desire. Most of us, faced with such storms of the mind, would have fled or fought, but the Buddha simply remained still. He touched the earth, declaring, "This ground is my witness." And in that silent gesture, Mara's army dissolved, not because they were conquered, but because they had no fuel left to feed upon. Stillness was the victory. Centuries later, a Chinese Zen master was asked by a student, "What is enlightenment?" The master replied, "Sitting quietly doing nothing, spring comes and the grass grows by itself." No fireworks, no grand display, just the simple truth that life unfolds naturally when we stop interfering. Stillness here is not passive, it is alive. It's the stillness of a mountain that outlasts the storm, the silence of deep waters that reflect the sky. But this wisdom is not found only in Buddhism. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher and Roman emperor, wrote in his Meditations, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul." Even in the chaos of empire, he understood that true refuge lies not in walls or armies, but in the stillness within. And in Taoist thought, Lao Tzu wrote, "The master does nothing, yet nothing is left undone." This is the paradox of stillness. When you stop forcing, life begins to flow with ease. Anxiety comes from pushing against the current. Peace comes from learning to float. Even today, we see glimpses of this wisdom. Think of athletes who describe being in the zone, a state where the noise of thought disappears, where action flows effortlessly, as if guided by something deeper than willpower. Or artists who say that their greatest work emerges not from struggle, but from surrendering to silence. These moments are not accidents. They are reminders of the stillness already living inside us. The stories all point to the same truth. Anxiety thrives in motion, in resistance, in clinging. Stillness, on the other hand, opens a doorway. It allows us to meet life as it is, without panic, without struggle. When the Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree, he wasn't escaping the world. He was entering it fully, with a heart unshaken. When Marcus Aurelius turned inward, he wasn't abandoning his duties. He was strengthening his ability to carry them with calm. When Lao Tzu spoke of doing nothing, he wasn't speaking of idleness. He was pointing to alignment, a harmony with the flow of things. And perhaps this is what we are being invited to remember, that beyond all philosophies and practices, stillness is not reserved for saints or sages. It is available to you here and now, in the pause between your breaths, in the silence between your thoughts, in the choice to rest even when the world is restless. But knowing the beauty of stillness is one thing, living it is another. How do we bring this silence into the chaos of daily life, into our commutes, our conversations, our restless nights? The path forward is not complicated. It begins with simple practices, simple shifts that gradually turn stillness from a story into a lived reality. Stillness sounds beautiful in stories, in the words of sages and philosophers. But the real question is, how do we taste it in our own lives? How do we bring silence into the middle of deadlines, traffic, arguments, and sleepless nights? The truth is, stillness doesn't begin with grand gestures. It begins with something so simple, so close, that we often overlook it: our breath. Right now, take a moment. Notice the breath moving in and out of your body. You don't need to force it. You don't need to fix it. Just feel it, the rise, the fall, the quiet rhythm that has been with you since the moment you were born. This is the doorway. Every anxious thought, every racing heartbeat can be softened by returning to this anchor. The breath doesn't live in the past or the future. It lives only here. And when you return to it, you return to the present, the only place where stillness lives. There is a story of a monk who was once asked, "Master, what is meditation?" He replied, "When I breathe in, I know I am breathing in. When I breathe out, I know I am breathing out." The student laughed, thinking it was too simple, but the master smiled. "It is simple," he said, "but not easy. The mind wants to be everywhere except here, but if you can stay with one breath, you can stay with life itself. You don't need hours of meditation to begin. Start small. When anxiety creeps in, pause for just 3 breaths. Deep, slow, gentle. With each inhale, imagine calm entering your body. With each exhale, imagine tension melting away. 3 breaths can shift an entire moment. Walking can be another meditation. Instead of rushing, try slowing down. Feel the ground beneath your feet. With every step, silently say to yourself, "Here, now, here, now." Suddenly, even the act of walking to your car becomes a practice in stillness. And then there is the mindful pause. In the middle of a heated conversation, before you respond, stop. Take a breath. Feel your body. Let the silence hold you for just a second. That pause is not weakness, it's power. It's the space where reaction softens into wisdom. Stillness in daily life is not about withdrawing from the world. It's about entering it more fully without being swept away. It's sipping your tea without rushing to the next task. It's listening to someone without planning your reply. It's lying in bed at night and choosing to breathe, instead of wrestling with tomorrow's worries. Over time, these small practices add up. The anxious mind begins to learn. Not every thought needs attention, not every fear needs action, not every storm deserves a response. There's a saying in Zen, you should sit in meditation for 20 minutes a day. Unless you are too busy, then you should sit for an hour. It's a reminder that busyness is not an excuse. It is the very reason we need stillness. Because without it, life passes in a blur, and anxiety becomes the only rhythm we know. But when you bring these small practices into your day, 3 breaths, a mindful step, a silent pause, you begin to discover that stillness is not something you visit, but something you carry. A presence inside you that waits patiently for your return. And once you've begun to touch stillness in these simple ways, something deeper becomes possible. You start to see that anxiety itself can be transformed, not by fighting it, but by seeing it differently, by reframing the restless mind into a teacher, instead of an enemy. We spend so much of our lives at war with our own minds. The restless thoughts, the racing worries, the voices that whisper, "What if? What next? What's wrong with me?" Most of us try to silence them by force. We push them away, distract ourselves, drown them out with noise or busyness. But here is the paradox. The harder we fight the restless mind, the louder it becomes. Like a child crying for attention, it only grows more insistent when ignored. What if the goal isn't to silence the mind, but to understand it? What if anxiety is not an enemy, but a messenger? There's a Buddhist teaching that says, the mind is like a monkey, leaping from branch to branch, restless and never still. But instead of scolding the monkey, what if we befriended it? What if, instead of pulling it down from the tree, we simply sat beneath the branches and watched? When you reframe your restless mind, you begin to see that anxiety is not proof of weakness. It is proof of awareness. It means your mind is scanning, searching, trying to protect you. The same mind that keeps you anxious is also the mind that helps you survive. So the practice is not to reject the restless mind, but to give it new meaning. When worry arises, instead of saying, "Here we go again," try whispering, "Ah, here is my teacher." The tightness in your chest, the buzzing thoughts, they are signals, reminders to return to the present. You might say to yourself, "This is not danger, this is only thought. This restlessness is a wave, not the ocean. I don't need to stop it, I only need to watch it." Here is a simple exercise. The next time anxiety arises, instead of labeling it as bad, try naming it as energy. Feel the racing heartbeat. Notice the restless thoughts. And then ask, how can this energy serve me? Sometimes that energy can be channeled into creativity, into solving a problem, into moving your body, or simply into a deeper awareness of the present moment. The restless mind is like a fire. Left unchecked, it burns wildly, but if you learn to tend it, that same fire gives light and warmth. There's a Zen parable of a man who was chased by a wild tiger. He ran until he found himself at the edge of a cliff. Below, another tiger waited. He clung to a vine, caught between danger above and danger below. Then he noticed a single ripe strawberry growing nearby. With one hand, he plucked it. With one bite, he tasted its sweetness. The story is not about escaping the tigers. It is about seeing that even in the middle of fear, beauty exists. The restless mind may surround you with tigers, but stillness allows you to taste the strawberry. Reframing the restless mind doesn't erase anxiety overnight, but it changes your relationship with it. Instead of drowning, you begin to float. Instead of reacting, you begin to listen. And in that listening, a subtle shift happens. You realize the mind was never your enemy. It was simply confused, searching, longing for peace. And once you begin to befriend your restless mind, a deeper practice awaits. Learning how stillness connects not only to you, but to something larger. An inner strength that emerges when silence is no longer just personal, but universal. Up to now, we have explored stillness as a refuge, a way to soften the restless mind, to ease the burden of anxiety, to find clarity in the storm. But stillness has another dimension, one far greater than personal peace. When you walk deeply into silence, something extraordinary happens. The boundaries of the self begin to dissolve. Most of our anxiety comes from this small, fragile thing we call me. My worries, my future, my reputation, my failures. The mind builds a cage around the self, then spends its life defending it. No wonder it is restless. No wonder it is exhausted. But in stillness, that cage begins to loosen. The I becomes less solid, less heavy. For a moment, you catch a glimpse of something beyond your personal story, something vast, timeless, and unshaken. The Buddha once compared the mind to a turbulent river. On the surface, waves crash and churn. But if you dive deep enough, the water is always calm. That depth is not yours or mine. It is the nature of mind itself. Stillness is not something you create. It is something you discover, hidden beneath the surface noise. And when you touch that depth, the anxious self begins to feel smaller, lighter, even unnecessary. You realize, I am not just this restless mind. I am not just this fragile body. I am part of something vast, interconnected, and eternal. This is why in many spiritual traditions, silence is considered sacred. Not because silence itself is holy, but because in silence we see what has always been here, the vastness beyond the self. Anxiety whispers, you are alone, you must control everything. Stillness replies, you are not alone, you were never in control, yet you were always held by something greater. Here is a practice. The next time you sit in silence, instead of asking, how do I calm myself? Ask, what is beyond myself? Notice the space around you. Notice how the silence does not belong to you, but simply exists. Rest in that space. Let yourself dissolve into it, even for a moment. You may find that the I, who was so anxious, begins to feel less important. The problems shrink. The mind softens. What remains is not emptiness in the sense of nothingness. It is fullness, a quiet presence that holds everything. There is an old Zen saying, you are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop. Anxiety makes us believe we are the drop, fragile, separate, in danger of disappearing. Stillness reveals the truth. The drop has never been apart from the ocean. When you remember this, fear loses its grip. This is the spiritual dimension of stillness. It is not just about calming the mind, but awakening to the vastness beyond it. The self is like a cloud. Stillness is the sky. Clouds come and go. The sky remains. And as you begin to rest in this sky-like stillness, a deeper strength emerges. Not the strength of control, but the strength of surrender. The kind of power that no anxiety can touch. The next step is to explore how this surrender becomes resilience. How the still point within us becomes unshakable. Even when life shakes everything around us, the world is noisy. Cities hum with traffic, notifications flash across screens, conversations buzz endlessly. Even in quiet rooms, the mind keeps racing. It seems impossible to carry stillness into such a restless world. But this is exactly where stillness reveals its greatest power, not as an escape, but as a way of living. Think about it. Anyone can feel peaceful on a mountain peak, far from society. But what about when you're stuck in traffic, when your inbox overflows, when life throws chaos right in your face? That is where the practice is tested. That is where stillness must walk with you. There's a story from the Zen tradition about a monk who lived in complete silence for years. One day his teacher sent him to the marketplace. The monk was shocked. The noise, the bargaining, the chaos, it shattered his calm. He returned to his teacher, upset, saying, "I lost my stillness." The teacher replied, "You never had it. True stillness is not lost in noise, it shines through it." So how do we live this way? The secret is not to resist the world, but to relate to it differently. Carry silence inside. Instead of waiting for outer conditions to be perfect, treat silence as your inner home. A single conscious breath can bring you back to it, even in a crowded room. Respond, don't react. When the world provokes you, stillness gives you space. That pause before you speak, before you act, is where wisdom lies. Let go of the noise you don't need. Not every notification deserves your attention. Not every opinion deserves your energy. Choosing silence is choosing freedom. When you live this way, people will notice. They may not understand it, but they will feel it. Your presence becomes an anchor, a calm in their storm. This is how stillness spreads, not by preaching, but by being. Consider a candle flame. In a still room, it burns quietly. But even when the wind blows, the flame bends, flickers, yet does not go out. Stillness is like that flame. It may flicker in the winds of the world, but it endures. And the more you nurture it, the steadier it becomes. Living as a still mind in a restless world does not mean hiding from life. It means moving through life with a different center, one that chaos cannot shake. And when you learn to live this way, something profound happens. Your anxiety no longer rules you. Instead, you carry a deep silence that rules nothing, yet touches everything. And this leads us to the final step in our journey, returning. From the very beginning, we have been chasing answers, chasing peace, chasing clarity, chasing relief from anxiety. Yet the more we chased, the further away it seemed. The truth, as the Buddha and countless teachers have reminded us, is simple. What we've been seeking was never outside of us. It has always been here, waiting in the silence of our own being. Stillness is not something to create. It is not a luxury reserved for mountaintops or monasteries. It is your birthright. It is your true home. The noise of the world, the restlessness of the mind, they are visitors. But silence is the ground beneath it all. There is a Zen parable of a man who spent his whole life searching for treasure. He traveled across lands, through deserts and oceans, until one day, broken and tired, he returned home. There, under the very floor of his small house, he discovered a chest of gold that had been waiting all along. Our stillness is that hidden treasure. We search everywhere else until at last we realize it was always within us. So what does it mean to return to silence? It means remembering that you don't have to fight your mind. You don't have to conquer every anxious thought. You only have to sit still, breathe, and let silence reveal itself. It means seeing silence not as emptiness, but as fullness, as the space where peace, clarity, and compassion naturally rise. It means trusting that no matter how loud the world becomes, there is always a quiet place inside you that cannot be touched. And when you live from that silence, you are no longer just surviving. You are living in freedom. Anxiety loses its grip. Fear loses its sharpness. Even suffering, though it may still visit, no longer defines you. Imagine the ocean. On the surface, storms rage and waves crash. But in the depths, the water is always still. You are that ocean. The storms of anxiety may stir above, but your depths remain untouched. To live in stillness is to remember the depth, even while the surface moves. So here we are at the end of our journey, but in truth, it is not an ending at all. It is an invitation, a return to silence, a return to yourself, a return to the home you never truly left. And whenever life feels overwhelming, whenever the world feels too heavy, remember this: peace is not somewhere far away. It is here in the stillness of your own breath, in the silence of your own heart. This is your refuge. This is your true home. Return to silence, and you will never be lost again.